Our modern world is held together by a fragile agreement. Everyone does their job. But what happens when someone breaks that agreement? Today, we're going to look at 6 cases where the simple phrase, "It's not my responsibility," became a death sentence. This isn't entertainment. This is a clinical analysis of catastrophic failure. Never assume that someone else has checked. Never repeat these fatal mistakes, get it? On December 14, 2011, at 285 Madison Avenue, the invisible contract of trust between New York City and its people was shattered by a single moment of negligence. It was a crisp, clear Wednesday in Midtown Manhattan, just a block away from the chaotic energy of Grand Central Terminal. The building, a stately 26-story pre-war tower, was buzzing with the morning rush, a vertical machine designed to move thousands of lives into the sky. Suzanne Hart, a 41-year-old advertising executive at Young & Rubicam, walked into the lobby with the confident stride of a woman in her prime. She was the director of new business, known for her sharp intellect, her vibrant energy, and her meticulous attention to detail. She had her coffee in hand, a schedule packed with meetings, and a life full of plans that extended years into the future. As she joined the crowd waiting for the elevator bank, she was completely unaware that her timeline had already been severed hours earlier by a simple, lazy act of negligence. The weapon that would end her life was not a gun or a bomb. It was a 3-inch piece of copper wire known in the trade as a jumper. Earlier that morning, a maintenance crew from Transl Elevator Inc. had been working on car number 9. The elevator had been acting up, stopping erratically between floors. To diagnose the problem, the technicians applied the jumper wire to the control panel. This is a standard, yet dangerous diagnostic tool that essentially hotwires the elevator's safety brain. By connecting 2 points on the circuit board, it tricks the computer into thinking the safety locks are engaged even when they are not. It neutralizes the machine's survival instinct, allowing the motor to run even if the doors are wide open. The cardinal rule of elevator mechanics is absolute. Never, under any circumstances, leave a jumper behind. But on this morning, the chain of responsibility disintegrated. There were 2 technicians on the job, and the dynamic between them was fatal. As the work wrapped up, a dangerous psychological gap opened up. One technician believed the other had removed the wire. The second technician assumed the first had completed the safety check. Neither of them physically verified the circuit. They did not communicate. They did not run the mandatory final safety test. They simply packed their tools, signed the logbook, and walked away. They left the elevator in a live state with its safety reflexes paralyzed. Each man believed that the final check was the other man's responsibility, and that assumption became a death sentence. At 10:00 a.m., the lobby doors of car 9 slid open. To the naked eye, it looked like a normal, functioning elevator. It was illuminated, empty, and inviting. Suzanne Hart was the first in line. She stepped forward. This is the moment where the subjective human world collides with the cold, unyielding reality of mechanical failure. As her foot crossed the threshold, the elevator's controller received a phantom signal from the forgotten jumper wire. The computer believed the doors were locked and the shaft was secure. It engaged the main drive motor at full power. Suzanne had 1 foot inside the cab and 1 foot on the lobby floor when the car suddenly launched upward. There was no warning, no alarm, just instant, violent acceleration. She attempted to pull back, but the laws of motion were faster than human reaction time. The ceiling of the rising car met the top of the lobby door frame, creating a scissoring effect with thousands of pounds of hydraulic pressure. The event was not a fall, it was a high-velocity compression. The mechanical force exerted on her body exceeded the structural limits of human biology instantly. She suffered catastrophic traumatic asphyxia and blunt force trauma that resulted in immediate fatal injury. The violence of the impact was absolute. The elevator continued to rise, dragging her body upward before finally jamming in the narrow shaft between the first and second floors. In the lobby, the scene was one of shock and chaos, but the silence of the machine was heavier. The fire department arrived within minutes, but the situation was immediately classified as a recovery operation. For hours, the building stood paralyzed, a crime scene of negligence. Investigators found the jumper wire still stripped and attached to the control panel, a silent copper testament to the "not my job" mentality. The technicians were not malicious villains, they were complacent workers who had normalized the deviation from safety protocols. One man thought it was the other man's duty to clear the board. That small gap in communication, that momentary shrug of responsibility, transformed a routine morning commute into a preventable catastrophe. Her death forced a massive rewrite of New York City's building codes, but regulations are just paper. They cannot bring back the woman who stepped into a steel box, expecting a ride to her office, and was instead met with the crushing weight of someone else's unfinished work. On March 15, 2008, the chaotic rhythm of New York City was interrupted by a thunderous roar that sounded like the earth itself was splitting open. But the cause was not natural. It was a catastrophic failure of human integrity. The city was preparing for St. Patrick's Day, vibrating with a festive energy, yet at a construction site on East 51st Street, a timeline of negligence was counting down to zero. Ramon Suarez, a 51-year-old construction worker, stood on the ground level, completely unaware that he was standing in the crosshairs of a preventable disaster. Ramon was a man of quiet strength, a dedicated father who viewed his dangerous job as the necessary price for his family's future stability. He trusted his helmet, he trusted his instincts, and fatally, he trusted the massive machine looming hundreds of feet above his head. This was a Favco tower crane, a steel giant in the process of jumping. A critical, high-stakes maneuver where the crane essentially lifts itself up to build the next floor. It is a procedure that requires mathematical precision and flawless equipment. However, the structural integrity of this multi-ton beast relied entirely on a single, fragile component: a synthetic polyester sling used to lift a 6-ton steel collar. This sling was the only thing fighting gravity, and it was compromised. The sling was old, worn, and deeply frayed, a piece of industrial garbage that should have been discarded months ago. But it remained in use because of a toxic chain of, "that is not my responsibility." The primary failure began days earlier with the site inspector. He had submitted a report officially certifying the crane's safety, but the reality was a cold calculation of laziness. He had pencil-whipped the document, signing off on the equipment without conducting a thorough physical inspection because he assumed the rigging crew would catch any defects. He decided it wasn't his job to get his hands dirty, shifting the burden of safety to the men below him. The chain of negligence continued to the crane operator and the rigging crew. High above the street, they saw the frayed fibers of the sling. They saw the danger with their own eyes. But in the high-pressure culture of New York construction, voicing a concern was often interpreted as an act of weakness or insubordination. The operator feared that stopping the lift to replace a $50 strap would cause a delay that management would penalize. He assumed that if the management wanted new equipment, they would have provided it. He silenced his own survival instinct, believing that the responsibility for providing safe tools lay with the office, not the worker. And in the office, the management was fixated on the schedule and the budget. Every hour of downtime cost thousands of dollars. They ignored previous requests for new rigging gear, operating under the assumption that the workers would make it work. They shifted the responsibility for safety onto the adaptability of the crew. Ramon Suarez was standing at the bottom of this pyramid of indifference, his life depending on a piece of frayed nylon that everyone had seen, but no one had claimed responsibility for. At 2 p.m., the hydraulic motors whined and the crane began to lift the 6-ton steel collar. The sling tightened. The synthetic fibers, already compromised by friction and ultraviolet damage, reached their absolute tensile limit. There was no dramatic warning, just a sharp, sickening snap that echoed like a gunshot. The sling failed instantly. The 6-ton collar plummeted, striking the crane's lower support structure with the force of a missile. This impact severed the crane's lateral connection to the building. The physics of the collapse were terrifyingly fast. The 200-foot mass, no longer anchored, lost its center of gravity. It did not just fall, it peeled away from the skyscraper, crashing down onto a residential building across the street and obliterating a townhouse. The sound was deafening, a roar of twisting metal and pulverized concrete that shook the bedrock of Manhattan. On the ground, Ramon Suarez had zero time to process the scale of the failure. He was buried under an avalanche of falling steel and masonry. The mechanism of his death was a direct result of extreme blunt force trauma. The impact of the debris caused catastrophic structural failure of the skeletal system and immediate cessation of vital functions. He did not suffer. The event occurred faster than the human nervous system could transmit pain signals to the brain. When the dust settled, the site was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered brick. 7 people lay dead, including Ramon. In the aftermath, the forensic investigation peeled back the layers of the tragedy to reveal the frayed sling buried in the rubble. It was a $50 part that destroyed a city block and ended 7 lives. The inspector who falsified the report, the operator who stayed silent out of fear, and the manager who prioritized profit, all of them had the power to stop the clock. Any one of them could have said, "This is my responsibility," but they didn't. Ramon Suarez was not killed by a crane. He was killed by a silent conspiracy of indifference, crushed by the accumulated weight of duties that everyone acknowledged but no one accepted. On November 9, 2011, the crisp autumn air of a Florida work site was dominated by the deafening, industrial roar of a wood chipper, a sound that masked the terrifying power of the mechanics hidden within. For 24-year-old Martin Perez, this noise was just the soundtrack to another grueling shift. But on this specific afternoon, the machine was not just a tool, it was a loaded weapon waiting for a trigger. Martin was a diligent laborer, a young man who understood that in the high-risk, low-margin world of industrial landscaping, his value was measured by his speed and his silence. He was operating a massive industrial chipper, a machine designed with a single, violent purpose: to reduce solid timber into aggregate in fractions of a second. This beast of torque and steel relied on a set of hydraulic feed rollers, toothed cylinders that grip branches with thousands of pounds of crushing force and drag them into an internal high-velocity mechanism. Under normal circumstances, this machine is a marvel of engineering, protected by a complex system of safety interlocks designed to separate the operator from the cutting chamber. But on this specific job site, that boundary had been erased by a culture of negligence. The chipper's safety bar, a critical mechanism intended to instantly reverse the rollers if a worker fell against the feed chute, was malfunctioning. Even worse, the electronic sensor that cuts the engine when the service hood is open had been deliberately bypassed. This was not a sudden breakage. It was a known defect. The management knew the sensor was faulty, but fixing it meant taking the machine offline for days, ordering expensive parts, and losing revenue. They calculated that the risk was manageable, operating under the fatal assumption that the workers would simply be careful. The mechanic had seen the issue but didn't repair it because he hadn't received a direct work order from the office. Martin and his crewmates knew the machine was a death trap, but they didn't refuse to work because they feared that complaining would lead to termination. The responsibility for safety was suspended in a void. The boss thought it was the workers' job to be cautious, and the workers thought it was the boss's job to provide safe tools. At 1:30 p.m., the inevitable friction between human error and mechanical indifference occurred. A large, stubborn branch jammed in the intake chute. It was a routine annoyance in a day filled with them. Martin did what he had likely done dozens of times before. He attempted to clear the blockage manually. He stood near the intake, reaching toward the jam, trusting that he could outmaneuver the machine. This is the moment where the "not my responsibility" mentality claims its debt. Because the safety sensors were bypassed to save time, the computer did not register the danger. As Martin pushed the debris, his glove snagged on a branch that the hydraulic rollers suddenly gripped. In a properly maintained system, the panic bar would have triggered, or the sensors would have killed the engine. Instead, the machine roared on, indifferent to the obstruction. The hydraulic feed wheels, rotating with unstoppable torque, pulled him forward. The physics of the event were instantaneous and merciless. The force exerted by the rollers was far greater than human tensile strength. Martin was dragged into the intake mechanism before his nervous system could even register the need to recoil. The machine did not malfunction. It functioned exactly as it was told to by the bypass circuits. It processed the material presented to it. The trauma was catastrophic and absolute. The immense pressure and the rotational velocity of the internal mechanism caused immediate fatal structural failure of the body. There was no medical intervention possible. The event was a non-survivable anomaly from the first second of contact. When the machine finally fell silent, the worksite was transformed from a place of labor into a crime scene of profound negligence. The subsequent investigation uncovered the bypassed switch, a cheap plastic component that had been rendered useless to save a few dollars in a few hours of downtime. The manager who ignored the repair request, the mechanic who didn't insist on the fix, and the system that prioritized speed over survival all played a role in the fatality. Martin Perez was not killed by a wood chipper. He was killed by the silence of men who saw a hazard and decided it was someone else's problem to solve. His death serves as a gruesome testament to the fact that when safety systems are viewed as optional inconveniences, the cost of efficiency is paid in human life. On June 19, 2008, the emergency psychiatric ward at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn was operating not as a sanctuary of healing, but as a holding tank for the city's forgotten souls. The air inside the GPEP unit was thick with the smell of industrial disinfectant, stale coffee, and the nervous sweat of dozens of patients waiting for help that seemed determined never to arrive. Esmond Green, a 49-year-old Jamaican immigrant, sat in the center of this fluorescent-lit purgatory. She was a woman of deep faith, a mother, and a churchgoer who had come to the hospital voluntarily because she was suffering from a mental health crisis and simply needed a safe place to rest. She checked in at the front desk believing she had entered a protected zone, but instead she had walked into a bureaucratic machine where empathy had been completely replaced by apathy. For 24 agonizing hours, Esmond sat in a hard plastic chair in the waiting room. She watched 3 different shifts of staff come and go. She watched nurses chat behind thick glass partitions. She watched security guards patrol the linoleum floor, their eyes glazing over the suffering around them. For a full day and night, the system watched her back, not with care, but with total, cold indifference. The hospital was critically understaffed and dangerously overcrowded, creating a perfect storm for the "not my patient" mentality. The nurses assumed the triage team was monitoring the floor. The triage team assumed the security guards were checking for physical distress. The guards assumed their only job was to stop fights, not to check vital signs. Responsibility was fractured into so many tiny, sharp pieces that no one felt the weight of it. At 5:32 a.m. on her second day of waiting, Esmond's body finally surrendered to the exhaustion. The security camera footage captures the moment with brutal, silent clarity. She leans forward in her chair, her body heavy and unresponsive, before slowly sliding off and collapsing face down onto the cold, dirty floor between 2 chairs. Her body convulses once, spasms in a final attempt to breathe, and then goes still. This is the moment where the story should turn towards rescue. In any functional medical facility, a collapse triggers a swarm of activity. Codes are called, doctors run, and lives are saved. But in Kings County Hospital that morning, the world was broken. Esmond lay dying in plain sight, and the room simply continued to function around her. Other patients, sedated and confused, looked at her but did not move. But the true horror was the reaction of the professional staff. Over the next hour, the CCTV footage recorded a parade of negligence that defies human understanding. A security guard walked into the room, saw her prone body, and did not even break his stride. He glanced down at her as if she were a piece of discarded luggage and kept walking. He didn't stop. He didn't radio for help. He didn't check for a pulse. He simply stepped around her. 20 minutes later, another guard entered the room. He looked directly at Esmond, then sat in a chair a few feet away, rolling the wheels of his chair back and forth, casually scrolling on his phone while a woman lay dying within arm's reach. A nurse walked by, carrying a stack of files, her eyes scanning the room but somehow filtering out the body on the floor. Each of these people made a split-second, fatal calculation. She's probably just sleeping, or someone else has already checked on her, or it's not my job to wake up patients. This collective delusion created a shield of invisibility around Esmond. The silence of the staff was louder than any scream. While her heart rhythm faltered and her breathing stopped, The people paid to protect her were busy protecting their own routine. It wasn't until 6:35 a.m., more than an hour after she hit the floor, that someone finally tried to wake her. By then, her skin was cold and rigor mortis was beginning to set in. The window for resuscitation had slammed shut. Esmond Green was dead. The cause of death was determined to be a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had formed in her legs from sitting in the same position for 24 hours, which then traveled to her lungs and suffocated her. It was a completely preventable condition. If anyone had encouraged her to walk or checked on her when she first fell, a simple medical intervention could have saved her life. But the tragedy did not end with her death. Subsequent investigations revealed that while Esmond was lying dead on the floor, a staff member was sitting in the nursing station falsifying the medical logs, writing that Esmond was awake and sitting quietly at the very moment her heart had already stopped. This act of falsification was the ultimate proof of the "not my responsibility" culture. The paperwork was more important than the patient. Esmond Green was not killed by a lack of medical technology. She was killed by a systemic failure of humanity. She was killed by a room full of people who saw a fellow human being in distress and decided, one by one, that it wasn't their problem to solve. Her final hour on the floor of that waiting room remains a terrifying testament to what happens when professional duty is severed from basic human compassion. On February 24, 2005, the underground tunnels of Boston's Back Bay Station were filled with the screech of commuter trains and the heavy smell of diesel exhaust. But the real danger was lurking silently beneath the feet of the rush hour crowd. Christopher Kelly, a 46-year-old veteran mechanic with the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, arrived at the station with a simple work order: repair Escalator 1, which had been stalling intermittently. Kelly was a man who knew these machines inside and out. He understood that an escalator is not just a moving staircase, but a 40-horsepower industrial conveyor belt capable of overcoming any physical resistance. To access the problem, he removed the heavy stainless steel steps at the top landing, opening a gap into the truss, the dark, greasy internal cavity where the chains, gears, and motor reside. He climbed down into the steel belly, squeezing his body between the massive drive chain and the step axles to inspect the mechanism. At this specific moment, his life depended entirely on the machine remaining dead. The gold standard for safety in this environment is a procedure called lockout tagout, where the mechanic places a physical padlock on the main power breaker, making it physically impossible for anyone to turn the power back on. But on this day, that padlock was missing. Kelly had engaged the emergency stop button at the top of the stairs, assuming that was enough. He operated under the fatal assumption that because he was working on the machine, the central dispatchers knew he was there. He believed that his physical presence was his protection, trusting that the system was watching out for him. But miles away at the High Street Operations Control Center, a dispatcher was looking at a computer screen that showed Escalator 1 was stopped, and he saw a very different reality. The dispatcher did not see a man curled up inside the gears. He saw a red icon indicating a service disruption. In the high-pressure environment of transit operations, the priority is to keep the people moving and the station flow efficient. The standing order was to attempt a remote reset to get the equipment running again before sending a crew. The dispatcher looked at the screen and made a calculation based on laziness and protocol. He assumed that if there was a real problem, the breaker would be physically locked out. If there was no lock, the machine was free to run. He believed safety was the responsibility of the field team. The field team believed safety was the responsibility of the control center. This gap in communication was the hidden variable that turned a routine repair job into a death trap. At approximately 2 p.m., while Kelly was deep inside the truss inspecting the main drive chain, the dispatcher clicked a mouse button to send a restart command. The electrical relays in the station basement slammed shut. The 40-horsepower motor surged to life with instant torque. There was no ramp-up, no warning siren, just immediate mechanical rotation. The drive chain, a loop of heavy steel links, began to cycle. Kelly was in a space no wider than a tight crawl space, surrounded by moving steel. The sudden motion knocked him off balance and the mechanism caught his clothing. The physics of an escalator motor are designed to lift thousands of pounds of human weight. The machine does not feel resistance. It does not stop for an obstruction as soft as a human body. Kelly was drawn into the narrowing gap between the moving step chain and the stationary steel structure. The entrapment was violent and absolute. The machinery exerted thousands of pounds of crushing force, compressing his chest cavity and pinning him against the metal framework. The event caused catastrophic traumatic asphyxia and severe blunt force trauma. He was unable to breathe, unable to scream, and unable to reach the kill switch that was only feet away. The machine continued to hum, fighting the resistance of his body until the thermal overload finally tripped the breaker. But it was too late. When firefighters arrived, they had to use hydraulic spreaders, the jaws of life, to dismantle the steel truss just to recover him. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The subsequent investigation by the Department of Labor exposed a culture of systemic negligence where responsibility had been completely abandoned. The dispatchers had been trained to restart machines blindly to maintain flow stats. The mechanics had become complacent about lockout protocols because it takes too long, and they trusted the dispatchers to call first. Both sides had abdicated their responsibility to the other. Christopher Kelly was not killed by a machine. He was killed by an assumption. He died because two people, separated by miles of fiber optic cable, both decided that ensuring the safety of the environment was not their job. His death forced a total overhaul of the MBTA safety protocols, ending the practice of blind remote restarts. But that policy change was written in the legacy of a man who was crushed by the very system he was trying to fix. On September 24, 2004, inside the grim, concrete labyrinth of the D.C. Central Detention Facility in Washington, a man was being slowly erased not by active malice, but by the passive, bureaucratic weapon of total neglect. Jonathan Magby, a 27-year-old man, was serving a 10-day sentence for a minor marijuana possession charge, a punishment that a judge had imposed despite being explicitly warned that the jail was completely ill-equipped to handle his medical needs. Jonathan was not a typical inmate. He was a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the neck down since the age of 4 after being struck by a drunk driver. He lived his entire life in a delicate ecosystem of care, relying on others for every single basic function of survival. He could not walk, he could not sit up, he could not scratch an itch, and most critically, he did not have the motor function to lift a cup of water to his own lips. To survive, he needed a ventilator to breathe while he slept and round-the-clock assistance to drink. But when the heavy steel doors of the jail slammed shut behind him, he was stripped of his specialized motorized wheelchair, separated from his ventilator, and placed on a thin mattress in a generic medical unit that was indistinguishable from a solitary confinement cell. The jail staff looked at this man, immobilized and vulnerable, and collectively decided that his survival was someone else's problem. This was the beginning of a slow-motion tragedy driven entirely by the "not my responsibility" mindset. The correctional officers assumed that the medical staff was handling his hydration because he was in a medical unit. The medical staff assumed that the correctional officers were assisting him with meals and water because that was standard protocol for inmate care. The day shift assumed the night shift had given him fluids. The night shift assumed the day shift had done it. For 4 days, Jonathan Magby lay in that bed, trapped in a prison within a prison, his own immobilized body. He was fully conscious, fully aware, and desperately thirsty. He called out for water, his voice growing weaker with every passing hour, but his pleas were absorbed by the indifferent noise of the jail. Guards walked past his open door dozens of times a shift. They saw a man lying still. To them, a quiet inmate was a good inmate. They did not see a medical emergency. They saw a body that was stable. Each officer who walked by made a silent, fatal calculation. Stopping to help a paralyzed man drink water would require time, effort, and paperwork. It was easier to assume that a nurse would be along shortly. It was easier to believe that patient care was the job of the infirmary, not security, but the infirmary was understaffed and disorganized, operating on the assumption that if an inmate was in distress, the guards would radio for help. Jonathan was caught in the deadly gap between these two departments. As the hours turned into days, his body began to shut down on a cellular level. Without water, his blood chemistry began to shift dangerously. He was suffering from acute hypernatremia, a critical level of sodium in the blood caused by extreme dehydration. As the water left his cells, his blood thickened, placing an immense strain on his heart and kidneys. The physiological process was agonizing. His mouth dried out, his vision blurred, and his confusion deepened as his brain starved for hydration. He was succumbing to dehydration in a building that had running water in every hallway and a staff of hundreds. On the morning of his fourth day, the biological limits of his endurance were reached. His breathing became shallow and labored. Even then, when he was clearly in distress, the response was sluggish. An ambulance was eventually called, transporting him to Greater Southeast Community Hospital. But the damage was irreversible. Jonathan Magby died hours later. The official cause of death was listed as acute respiratory failure and critical dehydration. He had effectively dried out while surrounded by government employees. The subsequent investigation was a scathing indictment of the entire DC correction system. It revealed that there was no specific malice involved. No single guard wanted Jonathan to die. Instead, there was a total vacuum of ownership. The judge blamed the jail for accepting him. The jail blamed the judge for sentencing him. The guards blamed the nurses, and the nurses blamed the guards. Everyone pointed a finger at someone else, creating a circle of blame that protected everyone but the victim. Jonathan Magby was not killed by a criminal. He was killed by a sequence of 20 different people who all looked at a dying man and thought, "That is not my job." His death resulted in a massive lawsuit and changes to how the prison system handles disabled inmates. But these reforms came at the cost of a man who spent his final days begging for a simple cup of water in a room full of people who simply refused to hear him. The technicians, guards, and managers in these stories received promotions, written warnings, or early retirement. Their victims received only silence. Now for the final verdict. If you knew that one action, skipping a safety lock, ignoring a frantic call, or falsifying a document, would save your company $1 million but held a 1 in 1,000 chance of killing a random coworker, would you sign the paper? Don't be a hero. Look at your own price and drop it in the comments. We know who you really are. If you value this kind of raw truth, subscribe now.